This is Selvam's story. He's currently at a crossroads in life. Let's see if the matchmaker, aka yours truly, can help him navigate his next move. My years in Maritime have shown me one thing. People can learn new things and find their place in the industry. I figure it's time to help Selvam change his world.
Hello, I'm here to see the matchmaker.
Won't you take a seat?
But I'm already seated.
You sound and look like the creative type. So tell me, what have you been up to? For work, that is.
Well, I helped out at a friend's pub between 2018 and 2019. I met a tattoo artist there. Then I joined his studio for about 2 years, apprenticeship, and did some paid work. Not bad. But the studio closed. Then I did plumbing. Joined an old-timer, went around fixing sinks and toilets. And for the past 5 months, food delivery and learning about 3D printing. I can 3D print my bicycle parts, you know.
What's next?
I've been thinking hard. Definitely not freelance. I saw this ad about marrying tech and creativity.
And what's this trigger for this thinking hard?
I want to get married soon. I have a fiancée now.
Ah, a girl. Love is such a wonderful thing, isn't it? Get ready, guys. And a 1 and a 2 and
You're not going to start singing, are you?
No. What made you say that? Cookies. Sounds like you've tried everything, almost.
Yeah, you can say that.
Have you tried Maritime?
I've got some friends who work in the port, but I'm not quite the type to wear a hard hat and stand in the sun.
Well, darling, you may find a hat or two that you really like. In Maritime, you need both logic and creativity to solve real-world problems. From what I hear, you've got what it takes. I know what you're thinking. Many moons ago, a young man just like you walked in through my doors. But unlike you, he let me finish my song. Anyway, his name is Justin, and he too had a creative spirit. He was a tattoo artist, like you were, a plumber, like you were. But anyway,
He thought his colorful work experience would be a disadvantage. But with mentoring and some hard work, guess what he's busy with these days? A purpose-filled career where he uses all of his previous work experience to help shipping companies become more efficient and sustainable through use of greener fuels and digitalization.
That's me. I've got an order to deliver. But thank you. I always thought Maritime was old-fashioned. Not even close. I'm definitely going to give this a shot. And you know, seize the day. But thank you for helping me see the difference.
Old-fashioned, you say? Just wait till the world sees the cutting-edge tech solutions Justin and his team are rolling out to help map more than 1,000 launch boat routes daily.